Hello everyone, welcome to Homemaking Radio and to the Manse. I'm Lydia Ruth, and I hope you'll find something to do while you listen today. And I think it's so important to wake up with gratefulness. So many of us are in a habit of waking up with dread or thinking what's going to go wrong today. Let's get in a new habit, especially if you're homeschooling your children. They're going to take on your attitudes. They're going to absorb your focus on life, and it's more important than anything they learn in a book. So let's wake up with what's going to go right today. And so many of you were so happy about the political situation and the changes that it meant for you and the optimism that they begin to miss that monkey on their back, that tension, that stress. And let's remember that God tells us not to have that anxiety, and He gives us the materials and the weapon and the key to avoiding it. And it was from a scripture that I read to you from Philippians, instead of Philippians 4:8, as we enjoy thinking on things that are lovely, good. It was the previous verse that talked about increasing your thankfulness. And that is one way to avoid the distress that goes on in the world. And increasing your thankfulness is so interesting, because just to wake up in the morning, especially if you're vital, can make you so thankful. And today I've been so thankful for you and for what you do for me, because it motivates me to have a message and to have a goal besides my ordinary work in the home. And one of the ladies sent me a $5 bill, and I want to tell you what that can do for me. Of course, it feels like I'm being compensated, but also I can buy a huge spool of thread at the Hobby Lobby, and I can get a box of tea for less than $5 at the Walmart. And at the Dollar Tree, I can get 4 items, and luxury items as well, things that we never used to use, like baking parchment and spatulas and cooking utensils that are made of steel. And I read on the handle, that it's U.S. steel and from a steel company in the U.S. And also there's notebooks. I got this notebook the other day so I could put all those sticky notes in it and then start transferring it too, so I can be more methodical in my thinking. And these notebooks are really nice, and I like the ones, and they have different colored, like some will have pink around them, and you can also paste on your own cover if you want to, but I like the ones without the lines, because then I can draw if I want to. Now, gratefulness, one of the things that you can be so grateful for is just to be able to go outside. And this morning, as part of my cosmetics, I went outside and held my face up to the mist and this light rain. It's my facial mask, and I felt so grateful that I could do that. And also, there's so much gratefulness in things like hot water, having a cup of hot tea or whatever beverage you drink. And I'm especially grateful today because I've snuck in some time early this morning before the plumbers get here, which when you live in an older house, these things have to all be redone eventually. And so we're getting the plumbing redone. It's not a luxury, it's a necessity. And all the water is turned off unless I go back to a spigot way back where the water starts and turn it on. And then I have to turn it off afterwards so that it doesn't continue to flow in the wrong places until this is fixed. So I am really, really grateful. Really, really grateful. And I think that the gratefulness also sends good endorphins or dopamine to your brain. You can look that up. There was a man on YouTube that did a wonderful video. I don't know if it's still there, but he did a video called Your Brain on Gratitude, Your Brain on Thankfulness, and what a difference it makes to your body too. And so it's so important. In that verse, if you want to read it, is about increasing your thankfulness, increasing your rejoicing, and other things that are listed in there. Those ingredients were there, and God never tells us not to be anxious unless He gives us the tools to deal with it, to do that. He gives us the grace to do it. And so gratefulness, I think, will go a long way in your homemaking and in your homeschooling. And the other thing that I was really, really grateful for was transportation. I have a car that works, has a few snags in it, but I'm grateful that it's there, and I can go to a grocery store within 2 miles of where I live. And I live out here on farmland. And all these years of living here, I grew up by the ocean because my father was a sea captain and a fisherman, and also used his boat for other types of labor, like building docks and building different things. And so I learned to love the ocean, and it's taking me all these years, but I absolutely am loving the farmland now, and that's because I noticed something very interesting. Ships can be tossed to and fro, and I've traveled a lot with my father on his ship and his boat, and could get very sick, and the waves could really be threatening, and it was quite scary, and there are a lot of ships that are destroyed or they sink. And I noticed something about bad weather on farmland is you rarely, never, I have never seen a tractor or any kind of a combine or any kind of farm equipment that got destroyed in a storm. There are no trees to fall on them. And I'm starting to just love being able to look out on this distance. You see the mountains in the distance across the flatland, and the flatland is very beautiful, and there'll be a layer of mist and fog, which is quite the subject of many mystery stories laying across there. And I like to have a contrast and put my teacup in front of one of those scenes and get a picture of the refined and the rough. And so today I'm going to be talking to you about refinement and influence, and a few other things, and I will be reading things from books that I have. And so that's my introduction. And someone asked me to talk about, and by that I appreciate your emails asking me for subject matter like this, and one was how the herbs and the scent is so important for our health and for our mood, and the scriptures do talk about it quite a bit. And the other one, there are some other ones here. So I want to be sure that I cover that somewhat today. It won't be in depth, but I wanted to tell you about my experience with it. And by the way, don't take anything I say too seriously. These are just my personal observations and the effect that some things have on me. You have your own story. It's just for your entertainment, and you don't follow me. You always check it out the way the Bereans did with what the apostles said when they searched the scriptures to see if these things were so. And so I'm also really thankful for hot water. I'll have to tell you, some of the nightmares I have are always me wandering around somewhere and asking people if they have any hot water so I could have a hot drink, or if I could come in and take a hot shower. And it was a premonition for all these things that are going on in my house now, with everything unplugged and turned off, and the amount of trouble I have to go to get hot water. But still not as bad as when I was growing up on the homestead in Alaska, and we brought water up from the lake before we got the plumbing put in. And I'll have to explain to you something about this idea of primitive living. Brought the water up in a galvanized bucket, set it straight on top of the cook stove. They called it the cook stove. and it was made of, I'm trying to think, some kind of metal that produced heat really well. Cast iron. It was a cast iron cook stove, and it had so many little compartments in it. That had a little water reservoir. You could put hot water in and keep it hot. It had little drawers you could pull out that were hot. You could put cooked food or buns in it, and it had other little sections in it, and you opened it up with what was called a lifter. It was like a poker, and you just put it in this little section and pulled up the burner plate and put in more wood. And anyway, that was hard. And then we had to pour the bucket of hot water into a little bathtub, which was also galvanized steel, and just big enough, to get in. And one of the things I wanted to say about this primitive living is that people can romanticize it, and they can say, oh, I would just, after I tell my story, they'll say, oh, I would just love to go homesteading and carry the water and heat it and all that. Yes, but we didn't love it. We were waiting. Everything starts from somewhere. So it started out us in a tent, and then my father and mother were building a house, and then after the house, they put in the plumbing. They dug a well. They put in the plumbing. They got a sink with a faucet. First, we had one of those, goodness, I've forgotten what they're called, where you pump the water from with a handle, and that came into the sink. And then they got a sink and a faucet, and then they had electricity, and everything was modern. And we didn't live there for that primitive living. And of course, we weren't connected to any kind of city or anything like that. Everything was our own, and so we were like off grid. So we wanted heat, and we wanted lights, and we wanted the comforts of life. And my mother had an electric vacuum cleaner eventually. It wasn't always going to be primitive. We want to improve, and it's the same way, ladies, with our thinking. We don't want to think on these lower levels of thought. We want to always advance and to learn and develop ourselves, especially if you are vital, because we want to be relevant, and we want to keep ourselves happy and thinking straight. And so today I'm going to talk more about something that makes the home more meaningful, and how you as a homemaker can have two things, and one is influence, and the other is refinement. And now I had shown you in previous, by the way, if you've got something to do, go ahead and go do it. I don't really have anything to show you today. Sometime I have shown you, some refining things that I learned in a little school I went to when I was very young, and it was for young ladies to learn to how to make introductions, and how to be a good hostess, and how to be more graceful in their movements, and how to dress. And it was way back in the late 1970s, early 1980s that I attended this, and things have probably changed quite a bit, but I wanted to pass on some of the little skills that I learned. Maybe they're not using them anymore, and I showed you how to get in and out of a door more gracefully. And there was another one that I've forgotten which one it was, but I want to also show you sometime when my house isn't such a wreck from all this plumbing, how to sit and stand out of a chair, stand up out of a chair and get out of a chair gracefully, especially as you become more vital, and how to be youthful. And after all the things that I learned, I can fall back on them and have more refinement in my movements at home, and feel more youthful, or what do you want to call it, youthized? I don't know what you want to call it. And I think I also showed you how to gracefully take off a wrap, a jacket, a coat, and in a previous video as part of this course that I took. And I could probably put it all in one video someday when I get the right place to sit, when I can stage a place to sit that doesn't have clutter all over it. And So for women, especially at home, we want to have a pleasant home and it starts with the woman. It starts with you being relaxed, content, and dressed in a way that you feel comfortable. You know, I can remember being younger and just feeling kind of off about something that I was wearing that I just didn't feel confident in it. And one of the courses that I took over the years said, you know, don't put yourself at a social disadvantage. So even in the home, dress in a way that inspires you, that makes you feel good. You can always put an apron over it. You know, one of the ones with the bib part, and you can get very nice aprons these days. You can get whole sets of them that are quite fancy, but in the place that I am, I have found that a black apron works better, but still, it looks quite dignified. Now, I want to read this to you, and then we'll work on some of these other things that I have here today. And I hope that you will start your day out by getting bathed and dressed just like a blank canvas and getting yourself dressed up and act like a new person today. When I was growing up, my family was so gracious. Even though we had the mistakes of the previous day and our parents were always correcting us, they always told us that when we went to bed at night, we could ask God to forgive us and make us whole and new the next day. And I'm always so grateful for that attitude, because we don't need to wake up bearing the burdens of the past mistakes and just letting that cloud our judgment, letting that cloud our enthusiasm for the home. And one of the things that has been so good about having home base and being a homemaker is that I can get the atmosphere that I want because I'm going to be living in it. And as I travel less and less and I go out less and less, it's so important to have the home atmosphere in every corner of the home that I'd rather be here than anywhere else. Now I want to read these two things from the Webster's 1828 dictionary. And the first one is refinement. And I've talked to you about refinement because the scriptures do speak of it. And it's in I believe it might be in Isaiah where it talks about Christ. And it says he is like the refiner's fire. And I have explained to you how I did this in some classes for girls, where I would take crude oil. When we used to change our own oil, we always had it on hand, and I'd put it in a glass jar with a lid so you could see what it looked like. It was dark and unrefined, and then I would take some other kind of oil, which was clear, to show how the difference between the refined and the crude oil. And then we would also talk about how the refiner's fire was to refine gold, and we would go through the process of how the dross and the dark part would fall off and then the shiny part would be there. So refining just means polished. And I would pass around a piece of old silver with a cloth and have each of the girls rub off the dross little by little and till it was shiny and clear. And so being refined just means take off the rough parts, to take off the unrefined parts. It's like sanding down a piece of rough wood. And so refinement in this old dictionary. The thing that I liked about the 1828 Webster's dictionary is whenever possible, a scripture was used with that word in it. But refinement, the act of purifying by separating from a substance of extraneous matter, a clearing from dross, dregs, or the refinement of metals or liquors. Now, the dregs, if you know what dregs are, it's the coffee grounds or the tea grounds at the bottom of the cup. Those are the dregs. And the state of being pure, polish of language, elegance, and purity. And one of the things that really is concerning to most people is just the refinement of being careful not to jump down somebody's throat suddenly or come in at the end of a sentence or hasty, what I call hasty, sharp replies. That is very off-putting. they can really send someone else, if someone's real sensitive, it can really send them into an abyss of depression. So we need to be careful from that. And one of the things that I'm developing is I want to write a little homemade magazine, and I want to have characters in it. And one of the characters is going to be Miss Well Anyway. This is to represent the effect that it has on someone when you want to talk about something, when someone wants to talk about something with you, and you start to engage in the conversation, and just as you are finished making a comment, they lose interest or they want to cut off your opinion, so they say, well, anyway, and then they move on to something else. And I just don't think that well, anyway, is any kind of a nice response. You've got to be careful. I understand if you have a class of women and they're going on and off the subject and and they've wasted half an hour talking about things, and you want to get back to your study, you can say, well, anyway. But in normal conversation between you and your mother, you and your daughter, you and your sister, you and your friend, to well, anyway, might not be good if you have a habit in doing it. It might be okay to use it once in a while to indicate that the subject that they are talking about is just a little too personal or gross. That would be okay. But to say, well, anyway, when it's just normal talking, and you are saying your part and they're saying their part, and they shut you off by saying, well, anyway. So my little Miss Well Anyway is going to be in my Play-Like magazine just for fun. And that is not refined. To push a conversation away with hasty, sharp replies and rude remarks. Let's talk about the mother. And a child comes and says, are we going anywhere today? Learn to respond graciously. This child has a soul. And never unappreciate the eternal destiny of these children. They are going to be bigger than you, taller than you. They might even be in charge of you someday. They're either going to love you or hate you. Or they also will develop these habits. They'll say, Mother, are we going anywhere today? And you'll say, well, I was hoping we could go to such and such a place after we finished our major work. Where would you like to go? And engage them. And also, when we were growing up back in the old days, the parents of that generation were notoriously bad about not involving you in their lives. It could possibly be that because they had sent us to public school and we had two separate things going on there, but you never knew what their plans were. They kept it always secret, and you never knew anything. So sometimes these children can be very anxious. I know I'm very anxious if I don't know what's going to happen to me, what's going on. And I don't like sudden things jumped on me all of a sudden, some sudden plans. And so it's the same with children. If you want to have a life of peace and harmony at home, which is one of the pleasantness, is to treat them as human beings and be pleasant with them, and not hasty, sharp replies. You don't need to say, I don't know, none of your business. This is not a good thing, because then they'll start saying it too. And so that's one of the things I want to work on when I'm doing these refinement lessons, is the polish of manners, elegance, a nice observance of the civilities of social intercourse and of graceful decorum. Refinement of manners is often found in people. And purity of taste, nice perception of beauty and propriety in literature and arts. Someone sent me a little series of pictures on a text of a museum she had been to where she'd seen some beautiful art. And I got to looking at these pictures and noticing that these artists, and they were of the 17th and 18th century, the subject matter was women doing domestic things, wearing beautiful feminine clothing, and they were either looking out the window, arranging flowers, sewing, cooking, baking, holding a child and reading a book, going for a walk, and these were considered inspirational to artists. And what kind of refinement that is. Refinement in nice perception of beauty and propriety in literature and the arts. You know, in homeschooling we try to be careful because people will say, oh, I want my children to have a classical education. You have to be careful of things that are called classics. They're not always good. They're not always refined. They're not always right. And if you can't find stories and good literature for your children, you can always write it yourself, and it will have a point to it. Elegance or improvement. Now, I always said edifying is very refined because to edify someone means to build them up and to improve the mind. Now, the other thing that I wanted to show you was influence. Now, influence, I have said, your appearance is a great influence. You don't think so. We used to, back in the day, dress up for the grocery store. Can you believe this? But the grocery stores were actually finer than some of our primitive homes. We lived in log homes, and we had a homemade braided rug, and our parents made coffee with a steel percolator on top of the stove, and the comforts and refinements were somewhat primitive. And we had homemade furniture, and my father built us a table and chairs out of logs. And so when we went to a store, a grocery store, or anything in the city, we dressed up to go in because we didn't think they would let us in if we looked too primitive or poverty-stricken. And I always used to enjoy going. In the summer, we would go into the city, and our parents would let us have a pair of shoes and a summer outfit. And I always enjoyed getting it, and then going back to where we were staying and dressing up in it. And then we would go to a few other places, and how pleasant and special that was. And we went on vacation, or what you call holidays. We always enjoyed going to a place to get a new book to read while you were on your holiday. We would sit at the beaches and read a book, read a good story. And also there was just the joy of these things, making them special ourselves. And so that was refinement for us. So now I want to talk about influence, because I believe that the homemaker is a great influence. And that's why they back in the beginning, when we began these blogs and these videos, there was such an outrage against us. Many of the homemakers quit. There were some beautiful blogs, and many of them just quit because they were so meanly attacked. And there was such an outrage against them because of the influence. And you know that you're doing something, you know you've hit on something good when the whole world starts turning against you. And I often say you also know you're straying on the wrong path when only your mother is upset with you. And there you need to think about that. Now, your mother might be upset with you for doing something that the whole world is upset with you too, but often it is just the mother that sees something. And so let's go on with this influence and what it means. And this is from the old 1828 dictionary. It's from the Latin word, it's a noun from the Latin word influence, inflow, to flow in. To flow in. Words are so interesting, aren't they? Literally, a flowing in, into or on, and referring to substances too subtle to be visible. For instance, you know, you walk into a grocery store, and let's say I'm wearing this little blue sweater here, and I don't realize the impact that has on someone until I understand the influence. When I saw this blue sweater at the Walmart, I thought, there's just something about that kind of blue that attracts me because it looks like the cornflower. Well, the cornflower I had seen that summer, I had felt its influence, its color influence. And the Bible talks about the influence of color and what colors were used for what. And so it's kind of an invisible thing, but you know you're making an impact even on your appearance. God has his influence in the very essence of all things. In a general sense, influence denotes power, whose operation is invisible and known only by its effects. It's the cause which is unseen. And that is one of the things that people objected to back in the day when we started homeschooling our children, is that they knew that it would be an influence on their minds, whereas when they were taken away from the home and put in an institution with other children their own age, that whole batch could be produced as thinking a certain way. There was an influence, and you hardly know it's happening to you. You hardly know. I didn't even know what had been done to my brain until I started homeschooling my children, and then I would say, well, I didn't know that. Well, let's read that again. And so the children and I learned together, and you don't know what damage it has done, the influence of the world. So, the influence, the power of truth operating on the mind, that's the influence. It's very hard to understand, but if you could just imagine someone who is a bad influence, maybe that's different. Someone who is a bad influence that you notice that after you've been around them, you start to maybe take on their accent, take on their, I'm not saying that would be bad, but just taking on their attitudes of griping, of complaining about everything, of being discontent with life. And so the influence, sometimes their influence, or it's kind of a thought process that they can impose on you, and we have to be very careful with that. Moral power, the power of truth operating on the mind in persuading or dissuading. We say arguments had no influence on the jury. The magistrate is not popular. He has no influence with the people, or he has greater influence with the prince. The rays of sun have an influence on whitening cloth. Now see, that's a physical influence. You hang something that's stained in the sun, and the sun has an influence on it. The influences of God on the mind, the influences of the Holy Spirit. And that's what the scriptures are. That's what the Bible is. It's an influence. So, to lead or direct, this revelation is sufficient to influence our faith and practice. So that's what the current political situation was all about. It was all about an influence. It was all about the mind. It was all about capturing the mind, and whether you're going to follow the bad influence or the good influence. Now, the homemaker needs to know these things. Even if you're not homeschooling, you need to know these things, that you are an influence. You don't live unto yourself. Everything we do seems to be somebody else's business. So if your influence is good, you're going to be happy, clean, neat, tidy, hopefully. Don't look at my place. I'm just obligated to tell you that. But we're enduring it as best we can under our circumstances with all the plumbing. Remember in the old book, A Room with a View, Charlotte and her boiler. She had to come and stay with her sister because of her boiler that was being fixed in her house. So now that we've done that, we might want to Discuss that with your children, the influence. The way you dress has an influence on your children. The way you work at home, they're going to be watching what you do. And here's something that you might not know. If you decide to homeschool your kids, every move will be noticed. They'll notice how many times you go to the fridge. They will notice when you say you are on a diet, but then you go around eating. They will notice all these things. You learn to live less hypocritically when you are living around your children, and your life is not hidden. Now, I want to continue with this book here, Once Upon a Time in America, the way America was, because I missed something last time. And I wanted to be sure that I read to you about it. And The Seasons of America's Past by Eric Sloan. Both of these are Eric Sloan's book, produced by Dover. It's possible to get a Dover catalog sent to you in the mail, where they have so many different things that they reproduce or publish. And I wanted to continue this thing about the spinning wheel, because back in the 70s, a lot of women attended spinning classes. It was all the rage, and it was to produce more interest in the wool that was being produced in Canada at the time, I think. And so classes were taught on how to spin, and then the old-fashioned spinning wool was being reproduced, and people were making hangings for their wool hangings for their home, and blankets and different things like that. But this man explains the old-fashioned spinning, and so I want to read this to you just as part of interest. Spinning wool by firelight, the early housewife must have presented a pleasing picture of womanhood. A lot of these old paintings showed the women spinning because it was their occupation, and also seemed to bring on a kind of a contentment. Exercise for the complete body, the process of wool spinning was a ballet-like movement. You know, he said the same thing in this book somewhere with the scythe, and how it became a ballet, type of ballet in the fields, the way that the men moved the scythe. Exercise for the complete body, the process of wool spinning was a ballet-like movement. The woman stood at the instrument, moving back and forth to manipulate the thread in rhythm with the turning wheel. And by the way, wheel is pronounced wheel, but I know they're called wheels, but we're always told to pronounce the H in a lot of like who, when, where, what. We always had to have the what sound, and I think it's kind of disappeared now, but I always taught my children to use it that way. A day's work involved footwork alone equal to a 5-mile walk. Now you think of it. If you go for your 5-mile walk, or how many steps that you have to have for your health and well-being, if you actually were spinning something, you'd have a product to show afterwards. And that's one of the reasons that I don't go too much big on a lot of exercise, because I want to do my stretches and things while I'm working, so I'll have something to show for it afterwards. The small spinning wheel that women sat at was not for wool but for flax. The operation, too, was considerable physical exercise. A day's work at a tiny flax wheel produced about a mile of thread. I've read this part to you before. Any woman who could spin that much was a qualified spinster. Remember, I told you that's how we got the word spinster, in the early sense of the word. The word spinster acquired a new meaning through the slang of schoolboys who thought of unmarried women as doing nothing but sitting at home and spinning, and so a spinster is now an old maid. Because women spun, the men did the weaving. Women were once called the distaff keepers, or the distaff side of the family. The reference has lasted through the years, and when you read Proverbs 31, you'll say, with one hand she holds the distaff. The inevitable emblem of so many American roadside antique shops, and I will say also the Australians, the South Africans, the Europeans, is the spinning wheel, has certainly stood the test of time. Made for use for indoors, yet spending its second century in weather that would disintegrate any modern metal sewing machine, the old wooden spinning wheel has proved itself to be a most remarkable example of early craftsmanship. Many people wonder who made them. As a matter of fact, spinning wheels were most often made by experts, and our earliest wheelwrights, you've heard that word wheelwright, some of you who watched Poldark had wheelwright, and the names of wheels in these copper mines. The wheelwright carried an assortment. They were sold to farm wheels. They were sold to farmhouse to farmhouse. Let me go back to where I was. Spinning wheels were often made by experts, and our earliest wheelwrights were not makers of wagon wheels at all, but makers of spinning wheels. The wheelwright carried an assortment of spinning wheels, which he put together on the spot as he sold them. The secret of their long life was the proper matching of seasoned woods, each one working against the other during weather changes. Without as much as one nail, square ends were welded into round holes, solid hard wood matched against springy wood, and superb machine resulted, which never loosened or fell apart. Probably no woods craftsman today would be equal to that job. So I wanted to read to you because my father built a house in the late 1940s, early 1950s, from logs in Alaska that he logged off of his own property, and he spent the evenings whittling these pegs with a little point on them, and the pegs were square and the holes were round because nails would split the wood. So when he put his logs together to make the walls, he put the square peg in the round holes, and the sap would mingle. And I was going to find out where this was in here, but in this book, Once Upon a Time in America, he explains about those pegs. Let's see if I can find them here. And you can always work when I'm trying to find my place, you can always work at home. Well, I'm not quite sure where it was, but, and that seems to always elude me, is this square peg in a round hole subject. How wooden pegs were squeezed into a hole and became welded. And I really recommend the Eric Sloan books from Dover because the drawings are so lovely. It says the nails were seldom used, not because of a scarcity of iron, but because driven metal usually results in splitting the wood. Tree nails were called trunnels. That means you would make wooden pegs, which became part of framing, giving and taking gracefully with each other during weather change. No early builder would think of using metal nails to put a house together. Instead, he chose the proper wood for pegs that favored the kind of wood used in that particular frame. In time, the beams and the fastening pegs exude sap and weld themselves together, always breathing with the changes of weather and without splitting. Pegs were often driven into their holes at a slight angle, or a squarish peg was driven into a round hole, so that the squeezed peg soon became an integral part of the framework, something a nail, of course, could not do. And I wanted to tell you about that because if you have boys at home, you need to get them a whittling kit and some balsa wood and teach them how to make you can always often get instructions on how to make a peg, and then get them some wood, some real wood, like a log from your backyard, from a tree twig or something, and teach them how to do that. And think of reviving these old skills. Now I'm going to tell you about a catalog you can get, but you have to pay for it. I'm not sure how much it is, and it's called The Lamplighter. And this is where you can get a lot more books that have the literature in it. You still have to be cautious. Read things before you hand them to your children. And there's for girls, and there's for boys, and I enjoy these so much because they're hard. They're really well-bound hardback books. How long has it been since it felt good to hold a book like in the olden days? And I love the picture on this magazine, and it's called The Lamplighter, and I will try to put the link where you can go and get yourself one of these, and then order yourself one every month. And you might have to not every book is perfect, you know, but just the general idea. So it's just about boys growing up to be men, girls growing up to be women. Some of it's fiction, and so I'm going to conclude by reading from Wives and Daughters. I do have a million more things to tell you today, and that is, we want to be before, when I finish reading some of this, to go into the housework and not making sure that it doesn't take over your life so that you ignore the needs of the actual people in your home. And some of you that grew up back in the old days remember the women would get so angry when they were keeping house, and they would get short-tempered with the children and short-tempered with everybody. And you can even read stories about it in the old McGuffey readers, where the men took to running away to a cabin to escape the spring cleaning. And so what we want to do is learn to be pleasant around our children at home, because it's like being betrayed when someone you love and trust and depend on turns on you with anger when you come into a room or ask a question, and they are frustrated by the work they're trying to do. They feel overexerted and they feel pressured, and someone says something to them and they snap at them. That is a terrible betrayal, and we need to teach each other not to do that, and teach younger women and children also not to do that. And one of the big excuses that people will use in the home is when you ask, well, why did you talk to me like that? Don't you know that I love you? I'm your sister, or I'm your brother. And they'll say, well, I was mad. You know what? That's not an excuse. What does the scripture say? What did Jesus say? Be angry and sin not. It's sinful. It's very bad to talk to people in a rude way. So you can feel angry, but you have got to restrain yourself. And you know, the Bible talks about self-control, and it also talks about captivating every thought. You keep it under wraps. You keep it in jail. And we need to learn that. You cannot go through life. That won't work in business. You cannot create a hostile working atmosphere for your fellow employees. And you know, one of the things that you can be very proud of is business, because, well, especially here in the States, because business has a couple of things they have to operate on. First of all, they're not allowed to be rude to the customer, because that destroys their business and ruins the livelihood of other people if they run off the customers that give them the money to operate. And the other thing is that you cannot, as a customer, create problems for the business or interfere in their ability to earn money, to earn a living. So it's really an intricate thing. I remember back in the days, the history of the Magna Carta, for example, which I think, when was that written? I can't think of when that was. Was it 1500s or 1600s? And also on the Mayflower that came to America with the Pilgrims, and I'm trying to think of the name of those other, not the Puritans, but there was another group of people that came too, and that was that it was against the law to take somebody's working tools away from them. If you couldn't take away their ability to earn a living, it was a basic human right to earn a living for their family, for themselves and for their family. You can't destroy their ability to earn a living. And so I think it's very important to remember to not betray the very people that are going to support you in your old age. I mean, maybe not, they might not have the money to physically support you, but they hold you up, and you have your future social life with your children. You need to learn to talk to them and treat them how you want to be treated. So let's read a little bit about Wives and Daughters, chapter 24, Mrs. Gibson's Little Dinner. And this was, the edition I got was Wordsworth editions. I like these kind, but I would have loved to have had it in a better cover. And so this is chapter 24, Mrs. Gibson's Little Dinner, written by Elizabeth Gaskell, and she calls it let me see what she calls this, an everyday story. And I'm starting to realize why she did that. Every little nuance, every little movement, every thought is recorded in these stories and gives us clues that those people were just like us. And also gives us a clue to how they acted. Mrs. Gibson's Little Dinner. And I find this story very refining. And if you have the videos, Wives and Daughters, they're about 3 or 4 discs, and it's by the BBC production, and then you listen to them. And also I have given you links where you can go listen to them. I'll try to find those again and republish them, as well as the 1995 Pride and Prejudice, because there's a lot of refinement and influence in them. Mrs. Gibson's Little Dinner. All this had taken place before Roger's first meeting with Molly and Cynthia at the Miss Brownings, and the little dinner on the Friday at Mr. Gibson's, which followed in due sequence. Now, one of the secrets to reading, if you're teaching children to read, is while they're reading one word, and I'll tell you a faulty way that we were taught in the public school. They wanted you to isolate each word and just read that word, and then read the other word. And it was a very stilted way of reading. And it would sound like this. All this had taken place. Well, we knew people didn't talk like that. And so we learned to look down the line of words while we were saying the first word. And you can do that. So while otherwise you isolate those words, then you don't have any inflection, you don't have any understanding, and you can't portray your reading in an interesting way. So you teach your children that while they're reading, pronouncing the first word, they're kind of looking at the second and third, and you can do that. You can. Your mind does that. And in the scriptures it talks about reading and writing, and how the people were to read these scriptures, or read these histories, or read something, and they were to write certain things. So we know that reading and writing, we have an obligation to teach it, and to teach it well. So while I'm reading the first word, I'm looking down to see what my inflection will be and my understanding of the words down the end of the line. So all this had taken place before Roger's first meeting with Molly and Cynthia at the Miss Brownings, and the little dinner on the Friday at Mr. Gibson's. Now when there's a comma, you pause, which followed in due sequence. Mrs. Gibson intended the Hamleys to find this dinner pleasant, and they did. Mr. Gibson was fond of the 2 young men, both for their parents' sake and for their own, for he had known them since boyhood. And to those whom he liked, Mr. Gibson could be remarkably agreeable. Mrs. Gibson really gave them a welcome, and cordiality in a hostess's very becoming mantle for any other deficiencies there may be. Cynthia and Molly looked their best, which was all the duty Mrs. Gibson absolutely required of them, as she was willing enough to take her full share of the conversation. Osborne felt it. Now, look, I just want to stop and talk about that, okay? Cynthia and Molly looked their best, which was all the duty Mrs. Gibson absolutely required of them, as she was willing to take her full share in the conversation. She required of them that they just look their best. You know, that's all I want. That's all I want for my children, is that they just look their best. And you will find that sometimes someone can be a bad influence on one of your children. Even if they're in their 20s and 30s and 40s, you'll find they'll let some things slip. And every time you see them, they've moved off, they have their own home and everything, and every time you see them, they slipped a little bit. They've kind of gone into the culture a little bit, and they're not looking after their appearance that much. They're real sloppy. They're not careful whether their clothes are in any way clean or coordinated or flattering to their figure or help them, feel dignity. And you'll notice this because they are rebelling and they're under an influence. Someone has said something, they're under an influence. They don't want to appear to be too snobbish, or they don't want to appear to be to care. And that's the influence we have in our culture today. You can't look like you care about how you look. And it starts with someone coming into a grocery store and you're the cashier, and you can't act like you're shocked. You can't act like you care. And then they can't look like they care either. But we used to kind of draw our little jacket a little closer to us and, try to look a little put together. And I really thought about this as I was reading this to you. It says, Cynthia and Molly looked their best, which was all the duty Mrs. Gibson absolutely required of them, as she was willing enough to take her full share in their conversation. So just as she was willing to take her full share of the conversation, she also required them to look their best. And so that was one of the beauties of having my children here for homeschooling, is that now every day they had a chance to look their best. And someone sent in a lovely comment some time ago when I did a video on modesty, is how she took her daughters to regular dress shops with updated styles in them, and let her have new clothes that were in style, but showed her how to choose them so that they weren't too low, too short, too tight, and you can find them, and just these principles that they could enjoy. And so that she enjoyed buying clothes, and she enjoyed wearing pretty dresses because she was allowed to see pretty dresses in the stores. You can go to Ross and Marshall's and the reject stores and the discount stores and TJ Maxx and Home Goods and many other stores, some that we don't have here in the north. But you can find some things. Now, I like fabric and I like to sew, but every now and then it's nice to have something that's already made. And one thing that I used to like to do when we went on any kind of holiday was I would pack lightly, and then buy something in that place that was more like that area to wear there. And that's one thing that I enjoyed doing. But I just thought that was an interesting little comment there. It says Mrs. Gibson was willing enough to take her full share in the conversation, as she also required them to dress their best. And you notice this integration of the older with the younger. There was no generation gap. The daughters and the mothers interacted well together. Just like as you are a vital person and I'm vital too, I want the young people to listen to me and to have similar interests in life, and I share with them. I know I have grandchildren that come, and I'm always interested in what they're doing, and I watch my granddaughters to see how they're doing their hair, and sometimes I'll say, oh, could you show me how to do that? And so there isn't a big gap between how they're thinking and how I am thinking. Osborne fell to her lot, of course, and for some time he and she prattled on with all the ease of manner and commonplaceness of meaning which go far to make the art of polite conversation. We used to kind of look down, when we got into more the modern life and the culture, look down on polite conversation. But it is so important because it breaks the ice and it puts people at ease. How's the weather? How's the farm going today? And how's everything going, and just this mundane sort of polite conversation kind of gets people warmed up. It's like acclimating or climatizing yourself. You know, when I get up in the morning, I don't just jump out of bed and act like I'm in the military and ready to go. I walk through and kind of get used to what the atmosphere is today, whether it's what the climate is like. I might go outside and stand there for a minute and get used to it, and I don't, it's just these little things. It's like polite conversation with my home. So ladies, I hope that all is well with you and that you will do the best you can with what you have and make life pleasant at home. And I just so appreciate all that you do for me. Your comments give me so many good ideas and anything else that inspires me, and I just appreciate you so much. So until next time, stay close to Christ. Goodbye.